up. I was in March in Colombia, in Bogota, and when I arrived home, I discovered two things that really shocked me. One, I was on the very last flight out of Bogota, and had I not been on that flight, I would have been the guest of Colombia for the next 7 weeks, because Colombia, unlike the U.S., did not give notice that they were going to close their borders. And I landed in Houston to discover that I was very lucky that I got back to the United States. On my way home, I decided to stop at the grocery store, pick up a few things, since I thought I'd be home for a couple of weeks. And the picture in the middle is what I found. The shelves were empty. We, of course, the world knows we all ran out of toilet paper. We ran out of cleaning supplies. We had no produce. We had no meat. We had no vegetables. We had nothing in the freezer case. We had nothing. We had no dairy. It was just incredible. I thought I had gotten off the airplane in the wrong place. Now, this isn't new. This pandemic is new, and how the world's reacting to it is new. And this is the first time that we faced the COVID virus. But it's not the first time that we've faced major crises. We're living in a volatile, uncertain, complex, and very ambiguous world. We've lived through the SARS pandemic. We've lived through the swine flu pandemic. The United States, we had to deal with 9/11, and we saw how quickly America can close its borders in the case of a terrorist attack on American soil, the worst since December 7th, 1941, when the Pearl Harbor attack happened. We've lived through tsunamis. We've had earthquakes. We've had the American economy meltdown in 2008 when the bailout started, and we watched all of our housing industry and medical care here in this country collapse. So this is not our first time. The one thing that we know is that it will happen. The things that we don't know is where and when. And that's why I loved it when I was in South Africa on that first trip that Ken mentioned, and I got to meet the gentleman that wrote the book, The Mind of the Fox. Is how do we look at the flags and determine where these crises may happen? And in fact, he and his co-author predicted the 9/11 attacks during George Bush's first year of his administration. So we're living in this very volatile, very uncertain, very complex, very ambiguous world, and we have to deal with it. I mean, that's really our only choice. We cannot control what happens around us. The only thing that we can control is how we react to it. This VUCA is the new normal for supply chain. I remember as the pandemic started to roll out, and I talked to a lot of executives, and they said, okay, what we're going to do, is we're going to get as many people to work from home as we possibly can. And then when things get back to normal, then we're going to go back to this, or we're going to postpone projects. And when things get back to normal, we'll get back to the projects. And the reality is this is it. This is our new normal. And we've seen over the summer as companies were starting to come to grips with the fact that this is the new normal. This VUCA world is our new normal. Let's look at a comparison of where we were in 1965 to where we are today. Think of the complexity in our supply chains. Back in 65, it was pretty low. Today, incredibly high. If we consider things like product life cycles and customer tolerance times, they were really quite long in 65, and today, very, very short. Product complexity, the product itself, customization, variety. In 65, very low, and today, very high. As we look down at the last one, transactional friction. In 1965, it was very high. It took a long time to develop a new supplier. Well, think about where we are today. Google is our friend, right? If we have a supplier that has an issue, we just go on and we do a Google search and we find a new supplier. So we can source globally with a few clicks of that mouse. And why did we pick 1965? Well, in 1965 is when all of our rules, all of our tools, all of the planning methodologies that we use today were developed and codified. This was the early days of Apex. I mean, Apex was founded back in 1956 because the computer was invented and these new rules and tools were developed. And we had to learn how to use them. Well, compare that to where we are today. Well, how many things have changed from 1965 to today? I mean, heavens, just look at where we were 7 months ago and how fast things have changed to today. When I landed from Bogota and came back home and sat and looked at my email as it happened over the next 10 days, I watched as my calendar that was totally scheduled, totally booked until December evaporate within a week. It was just the most incredible thing that I had ever seen. Now, what else is going on? Well, Harvard published this back in 2016, And this is a very interesting analysis of the public firms in the United States. Now, this is the backbone of the American economy. And you can like the U.S. or hate the U.S., but the reality is as our economy goes, pretty much so goes the economy of the rest of the world. For example, in 2008, when our stock market crashed here. Well, what was very interesting is this is 2016, and what they estimated is they said one of three companies will delist in the next 5 years. Now, as we know, the American economy between 2016 and 2020 was much better than anybody ever anticipated. And the GDP growth rate was significantly higher than what we were told in 2016 would be the new normal. But still, companies are failing. And what they estimated is that in 2016, it was already 6 times the delisting rate of companies just 40 years ago. And what was interesting is it didn't have anything to do with the company size, the company age, the industry, what it was in. It wasn't good management, bad management. It was really all about companies failing to adapt, that the rate of change outside the company was faster than the rate of change inside the company. So we really only have 2 choices, adapt or die. So how do we do that? How do we move forward? How do we look ahead? Well, first, we have to start with the assumption that we are living in a VUCA world and that big disruptions are going to happen. We need to assess the risks. And I understand that there's a quiz shortly after this presentation with Greg Schlegel in Lehigh University. And Greg's done some great works on identification of supply chain risks. What are those risks that are coming at us? What are the big disruptions that could happen? What flags are we seeing about the things that could come at our supply chain? The second is that leadership cannot build business and supply chain models based on a profit maximization strategy that ignores rule number 1. Well, rule number 1 is disruptions are going to happen. The only thing that we don't know is where and when. So we have a need for resilience. Well, we've heard a lot about resilience lately, but what actually does it mean? What's the definition? Well, the definition of resilience is that ability to maintain or restore system equilibrium through or after large shocks. And I think you would agree with me, we're going through a large shock right now. So some people refer to this as robustness and resilience. That robustness is how much pressure can our supply chain take before it breaks, and resilience is how fast can we get back to system equilibrium. But the question that's got to be in your mind, you've all heard about resilient supply chain. How do I do that? How do I build this resilient supply chain? Is there really something we should focus on? Has somebody figured this out? Is there a blueprint? Or are we just crashing around in the dark hoping that we get it right? First, let me give you a warning. And warning is management cannot focus on cost minimization to build a post-COVID-19 supply chain strategy. We have been trapped for years in this belief that if only I reduce cost, that I'll improve the overall profitability of the company. Not only is that false, but any focus on cost minimization or using cost as the main focus will cause a supply chain to be incredibly fragile and actually increase cost. And we'll go to General Akbar here. It's a trap. It's a trap that many managers get into, is that their focus is on cost. Why? Well, because cost jeopardizes resilience. We have a very fragile system when we focus on cost, because a cost strategy, a cost minimization strategy, relies on a very predictable and consistent volume to attempt to maximize profit. Well, is anybody living in a predictable and consistent world right now? I know I haven't seen one. And when we don't realize the volume in a predicted way, all right, there's 3 big bottom line impacts. And first, we're going to get too much of the wrong inventory. Second, we're going to get too little of the right inventory. And third, we're going to spend a whole lot of time, money, and effort trying to attempt corrections to get the wrong to the right and the right to the wrong. And we end up with a train wreck, as we can see up there in the upper right-hand corner. Because when this happens, it means that the assets of the company, the thing that you help us generate return on assets are fundamentally misaligned. They are distanced from the actual demand of the market. And the larger the disruption, the worse the misalignment. And back to the United States and our planning methodologies here, it's very interesting, as Ken and I were chatting about this just before we went on the air, about the United States is very nervous right now. It's very nervous about what's going to happen in January as whatever president is brought into office. And what we're seeing is that things like toilet paper and hand sanitizers are now on sale. Okay, they're putting them on sale. Buy one, get one free at a time that the Americans are still stocking up and the shelves are still empty. This is crazy. Why would they do that? All right, it is a worse misalignment that I've ever seen, is that things that were in short supply are now on sale. And the thing is that they're not available. You try to buy it, it's not there. And you're getting substitutions for the items that are on sale. So the larger the disruption, the worse the misalignment. And the bigger the misalignment, the lower the chance of survival. This is all about being able to survive and thrive during these VUCA times. So it's how do we bring this alignment and coherence? What should we focus on? What is the secret sauce, if you will? What's the secret? Well, it's all about flow. And if you want to follow my Twitter feed, that actually is my Twitter feed. It's all about flow. Well, when I have good flow, anybody that's had any experience in lean knows this. When I have good flow, what do I have? I've got good service, right? My service is consistent. My service is reliable. And then when I have good service, what happens to my revenue? My revenue is maximized and protected because, of course, that's what customers want is good service. Well, if I have good service and I have good revenue, well, I know that I've got minimal inventories. Let's stop here for a second. But what have we been taught? We've been taught to have better customer service. We have to have more inventory. Well, that's being trapped in the cost world. Because what we all know is that as I have better flow, I have better service with less inventory and substantially less inventory. And then I also have fewer expenses. When I have good flow, cost is at its minimum because I'm not doing all those non-value added activities that are required to try to balance our resources to what really the market needs. And finally, cash flow follows the rate of product flow to our market demand. Now, this is critical because a company can be on a balance sheet or a profit and loss statement profitable. And they can go out of business because they don't have enough cash. And especially during these pandemic times, cash flow is an issue. I know it has been for a lot of the folks in our network, is that cash flow is really a big issue. We can be profitable, but we need the cash. So when I have good flow, I get all these things. I get service, I get revenue, I get lower inventories, I get reduced expenses and improved cash flow. So I would submit to you that those are all the components of something that's very important, which is return on investment. That ROI is really what the objective is for our companies today. And as I go around the world, a lot of people have read The Goal. They say, oh, the goal is to make money now and into the future. Well, you got to really think about how you measure that. And that's where the distortion starts. Because people say, well, make money, that's profit. That's not what Ellie meant. If you really reread the book, and if rereading is a tough thing, they did bring it out as a graphic novel, so it's like a cartoon book now. But if you reread it, you'll discover that what Goldratt was really talking about was return on investment, was how do I get the best profit given the investment that I've made? And that's ROI. So as I protect and promote flow, I will maximize ROI. Well, flow is a common objective already across many disciplines. Let's look at our MRP world. That gentleman on the left is Joe Orlicke. He wrote the book on MRP in 1975. Any of us that have been around the Apex organization for any length of time used that little orange book and memorized it to pass the MRP exam. The guy in the middle was Ollie White. Ollie was tireless in the early days of Apex and starting in 1956, out every weekend doing education to try to educate this new market on people of how to use these new tools that they've been working so hard on. And of course, the gentleman on the right is George Plazel. And I know George has been to South Africa several times because he was there one of the times that I was there. And he wrote Orlicke's second edition. And the focus of all three of these gentlemen is how do we synchronize demand and supply? Then, of course, Ollie White had the vision for MRP2. How do we integrate the financial accounting? And he wrote that book, unfortunately, before he died at a very young age. But they knew it was about flow. Now, let's look at Taiichi Ohno. Taiichi Ohno is the father of Lean, helped with the Toyota production system. And if I ask anybody around the world what the objective of Lean is, they'll tell me it was to reduce waste. Well, that doesn't happen to be true. If you look back, what Ohno wrote about wasn't waste reduction. He wrote about his river production system, and that waste reduction is the result of focusing on flow. How about Dr. Goldratt? Right? The Theory of Constraints, wrote The Goal, one of the smartest men I've ever known in my life. And his whole objective of TOC was to improve system throughput given constraints, understanding that supply chains are non-linear systems. They have interrelationships, and there's a constraint. Then we need to still improve our system throughput. And finally, the other bookend of the American on the other side, not that we listened to him. Of course, we didn't. We sent him to Japan to help Japan rebuild after World War II. And that was W. Edwards Deming. His whole focus was how do we reduce variability? He was the father of Six Sigma because he understood that as variability increased, flow decreased. All have the same foundation. You know, I lived for so many years, and Ken has too, and what I call the war of or. Either you did MRP or you did Lean, and the two worlds fought. Or you did TOC, and the worlds fought. And we listened to all this about you don't need MRP, and MRP is bad. It's really all the same. They all have the same foundation, which it's all about flow. So George Plazel, anytime you had the opportunity to hear him speak, he always gave his first law of manufacturing. We've renamed that as Plazel's Law out of respect to George. And it's all benefits are directly related to the speed of flow of materials and information. George was an MRP guy. Right? I mean, he wrote the second version of Orlicky's MRP, but he understood that everything was about the speed of flow. And that's in that second edition of Orlicky's MRP. So is this flow focus new? Have I told you anything new? You know, here you're listening to me in a virtual conference and I'm up at, 4 o'clock in the morning to do this. Why would we do this? Is it new? Of course not. Taylor knew about flow. Frederick Taylor, his whole objective was about time standards and variances. But his work transformed the world from craftsman or artisan-based businesses to mass production, which allowed this next guy to do what he did. He learned from Taylor, never would admit it, but his whole objective was scale, system velocity at scale, vertical integration. This is Henry Ford. And in a time where the American automotive industry was highly fragmented, Ford had 85% market share. You could have a Model T in any color you wanted as long as it was black. He was vertically integrated from mining the iron ore all the way through the dealerships and delivering the cars to the customers. Because you got to remember, back in those days, there was no trucks to put cars on the back of. So there was some assembly required as those cars rolled off the line and were packed up to get out to some of the areas of the United States. Well, that allowed this guy, F. Donaldson Brown. Now, what is Brown? Most of you have never heard about Brown. Brown is actually the creator of managerial accounting. He worked at DuPont. If you've ever used the DuPont ROI model, that was the creation of Brown. His whole objective was about the market. It was about market segmentation and creation. It was about relevant information. Well, he left DuPont and hooked up with another American businessman named Albert Sloan, and the two of them went to a very tiny little startup car company called General Motors. And you might be laughing because you think, GM, wow, it's a big company. Well, it is today, thanks to Brown. Because Brown and Sloan got their heads together and they realized what they needed to do. Ford had 85% market share. So they brought to market something that had never been seen before. In every marketing book, or write it up, that General Motors brought out cars that had different colors. And I always like to ask live audiences, do you really think Americans are that stupid? To which most of them will usually nod their heads and say, yeah, we do. But they're really not. What Brown and Sloan brought to market was something that had never before been seen, which is financing. They brought the offer a GMAC, General Motors Acceptance Corporation. So now, for the first time, an American could buy a car based on time, a car loan. Ford thought that was just the worst thing he'd ever seen, and he thought it never should have happened. But the reality is the American people loved it. You could buy a car for a couple dollars a month instead of having to save up the $650 you needed to buy a Model T. Within a year, the Ford plant in River Rouge was closed for retooling. That fast. It's all about flow. Flow and not unit cost minimization is the focus. And that's something that hasn't changed. Because how do we explain flow? We can only improve something if we can measure it. So what I said is Plausi's law, all benefits directly related to the speed of flow, and flow drives ROI. Well, what is flow? Flow is the rate at which a system, not a computer system, folks, a systemic supply chain, converts material to product required by a customer. Well, what's cash velocity? Well, cash velocity is the rate of net cash generation. Now, this is revenue or sales dollars minus truly variable costs. All right. Now, this is what the TOC world would call throughput. In the managerial accounting world, we call this contribution margin. Now, we also need to subtract the period operating expense. And then third, what is net profit divided by investment? Well, that's the formula for ROI. Always has been. So that's how we look at flow. Now, if I produce a product and it's still here, that's not flow. Okay, that's investment. Now, let's take a look at how do we quantify flow. Well, we're going to qualify flow with something called Little's Law. Little's Law says if I look at my units output per day times my lead time, that's my work in process, obviously. Or I can do my WIP divided by lead time is my throughput, or my WIP divided by my throughput is my lead time. How do I reduce lead time? Reduce WIP. How do I reduce WIP? Reduce lead time. It's obvious. Now let's look at flow in our company vital signs. If you go to the doctor, what's the first thing they do when you walk in the door? Besides asking you for your insurance card, they take your temperature, they listen to your heart, they take your blood pressure. If any of those things is out of whack, you go to the hospital immediately. All right. If they're all within a certain operating range, then you wait, right? You wait for the doctor to come see you. Well, in a company, we also have company vital signs. First is how much working capital, inventory, cash, and credit do we have trapped in the business? Second, what's our contribution margin? Okay, what is that revenue minus our variable cost? And third, what's our customer base? What is our market share? That's the vital signs of a company. And when one of those goes out of whack, it's all hands on deck. And if it gets too far, well, then the company collapses and seems to go out of business overnight. Well, here's the truth about cost. And a lot of people say, well, Carol, you just don't care about cost. Not true. I know how to impact cost. The better things flow, the better costs are controlled. Okay, cost is an output, not an input. This is so obvious. I'm sure that in the first 30 minutes, I have not told you anything new. But there's a big but. If we all know this, then why are we not all doing this and maintaining the focus on cost and leaving cost behind and focusing on flow? Well, we've got relevance lost. If all benefits are directly related to the speed of flow, then what's impeding flow? Well, it's variability. Well, variability is defined as the difference between what we think is going to happen and what happens. As I mentioned, that I came off the road in March. I had a full calendar. Somebody had asked me while I was gone into Bogota, when's the next time you can come see us? And I said, December. That's the first opening that I had. Well, between March and today, I haven't been back on an airplane. Haven't seen one. So big difference between what we thought was going to happen and what happens. As variability goes down, flow goes up. We know because it flows better, right? I mean, this is the whole point of getting rid of the rocks in the river that we've used as an analogy for lean for so long. As variability goes up, flow goes down. That's why we don't want to drain the river too quickly, okay? Because as variability goes up, we know the flow goes down. And if we drop the water level too fast, then the boats don't float. Pretty simple. Well, we still must be missing something. There's still a gap there. Well, what's that gap? It's all about visibility. What is visibility? It's defined as relevant information. And that's a big R word there, relevant. What is relevant? Relevance is where there is a difference in the things that we are deciding, and that's what determines things as relevant. As my visibility goes up, my variability goes down. As my visibility goes down, my variability goes up. Now, I was born and raised in the city here in the United States called Buffalo, New York. Well, Buffalo is internationally acclaimed for its snowstorms. If you try to drive in the middle of a snowstorm, there's something that's called a whiteout, where it looks like somebody just put a white blanket on your windshield, and good luck trying to find the road. And we used to deal with that, okay, because you'd get any little peak of visibility that you could get, but you didn't drive very fast. If you could see, we drove really fast on bad roads, but if the bad visibility, you drove really, really slowly. Now, out here, and I think you have them in Africa as well, they're called haboobs, which is sandstorms. That you don't drive in at all. You're an idiot if you try to drive in a sandstorm. It's a good way to get killed. So zero visibility, yeah, you're not moving. But if I have good visibility, and that's what they always tell you as you fly, oh, we've got 20 miles of visibility, and then we can go very, very fast. Because visibility mitigates variability. If I can see something coming at me, I can get myself around it. So, what are our rules for this VUCA world, this new world that we're in? Well, first, let's look at Plausi's law. All benefits directly related to the speed of flow, right? When a business focuses on flow, better cost performance always follows. However, the opposite is never the case. Never. As I focus on cost, I will always destroy flow. The next rule is something is productive if and only if it leads to the better promotion and protection of system flow, because flow drives ROI. Therefore, something's productive only if it drives flow, because flow drives ROI. And something is efficient if and only if it leads to better promotion and protection of system flow. Again, it only counts if it's out of here. Being efficient and stocking things up in this warehouse, that's not efficient. That's crazy. All right, that's investing too much in working capital, and you're driving down ROI. So as Ken mentioned, DDMRP. Well, what is DDMRP? And it's always interesting when I'm at a live conference, people will walk up to me and say, I don't believe in it. It's not a religion. You don't either believe in it or not. It's a methodology. Very simply, it's a methodology. To do what? That first word is the key word, is to model, then plan, then manage supply chains. To model supply chains to do what? Protect and promote the flow of relevant information. As Ken said, we wrote the third edition of Orlicky's MRP. The fourth edition is in work right now. That's got to go to the publisher by the first of the year. Well, we first articulated DDMRP in 2011 on the invitation of McGraw-Hill to write that third edition of Orlicky's. And you can see the cover. That's what we view as a supply chain. And the latest version is the DDMRP book, and that's version 3. It's the English version that is now in full color. Well, that didn't happen overnight. Chad and I just did not sit in a room and say, well, let's think great thoughts and this should work. It was after 15 years of application and research and pragmatic experience and application of different concepts to try to figure this out. In fact, my very first APIX International Conference was a case study of an aerospace company that had combined MRP, lean, and theory of constraints. And I was the plant manager. And that case study was called Yes, You Can, because we were still living through the war of ore, where we believed that these techniques were at war with each other. They're not. The innovation fuses these mainstream improvement disciplines because they have the same foundation. It's flow. We are living in the land of and. It is MRP and DRP and lean and theory of constraints and Six Sigma. And how that all is harmonized together is this innovation of the focus on flow. So it's not just pure pull. It's position, protect, pull, and adapt. That first step is position. We have to strategically select decoupling points. And think of a decoupling point as a firewall in our supply chain. There's certain risks that you've got to identify. And Greg Schlegel and his team at Lehigh University have done a great job of identifying supply chain risks and how do you identify them. Well, once you've identified them, then what do? You don't say, well, okay, it's there, now what? All right, how does that affect my strategic positioning? There's 6 factors that go into that strategic positioning. It's customer tolerance time, market potential, lead time. Where's our inventory leverage? Do we have an operation we need to protect? Do we, what is our visibility of our customer orders? And of course, what's our external variability? All those go into these strategic decoupling points that are positions of independence in our supply chain. They have to absorb variability coming at it from both sides, so they have to be protected. So those are the buffer profiles and levels. How do I protect those firewalls to minimize the fire that escapes from one room to the next? And then third, how do I dynamically adjust that? Because my supply chain is not static. Then it gets to the easy part, the pull side. We do demand-driven planning and visible and collaborative execution. DDMRP is both a planning and execution methodology, where MRP is a planning methodology only. But the whole picture is just not DDMRP. That's only the starting point. And a lot of people, a lot of writers that don't understand what DDMRP is, treat DDMRP as if it's the be-all and end-all and the end destination. And they say, well, and it doesn't do that, and it doesn't do that. Well, of course it doesn't. It's only the starting point. DDMRP is 1/3 of a flow-based operating model. It takes actual demand, and it then does order release. It sends manufacturing orders out for scheduling. It sends purchase orders and stock transfer orders out to position buffers, and then it comes back with a promise date. So there has to be some kind of a demand-driven scheduling, which is a finite scheduling of control points. The buffer management gives us the health of those strategically selected in points of independence. Demand-driven scheduling, of course, we want to track those manufacturing orders. Notice that each of those is this closed loop, is a plan, do, check, act loop. It's a define, measure, analyze, improve, control loop. But the overall process needs to be overseen. And it's overseen by an S&OP function, DDS&OP. That sets the model parameters. That oversees the positioning, the sizing, and the dynamic adjustments. This is the tactical planning. And so that also has to be closed loop. There has to be variance analysis, looking at both capacity and supply order generation back to DD-S&OP. We just did not take DD and stick it in front of S&OP. This is a missing link. We've been working very closely with Dick Ling, who's the father of sales and operations planning. First 2 questions. Yes, he's very much still alive, and yes, he's just as sharp as he ever has been, to work how does S&OP integrate with a flow-based operating model. He was very excited about DD-S&OP. He said, this is the missing link. We now finally have a tactical, bidirectional reconciliation inside S&OP. So what's the difference between MRP and DDMRP? Well, MRP doesn't decouple. The power of MRP is everything is dependent. Well, that forces us into longer planning horizons, accumulates variability as we attempt to use a master production schedule to say this is what we can and will build. DDMRP strategically determines decoupling points, compresses lead times, and absorbs variability. This is why during these times of pandemic, the companies that have had DDMRP, it was very interesting, March, April, May, June, the phone calls that we got of the buffers are holding, the buffers are holding. We're like, never underestimate the power of a buffer. Well, MRP was never designed to manage stock positions. Its happy place is when its projected of available balance is 0. Now, 0 can be safety stock, but it's happy when it's at 0. And all the planner messages are when it's not 0. DDMRP is designed specifically to manage strategic stock points. It never nets to 0 because those points are there because it absorbs variability, it decouples, and most importantly, it is driving ROI by having those positions there. MRP, most of our safety stock and reorder points are static. Set it and forget it. And DDMRP, absolutely not. It adapts daily. This is why the world's largest software companies have invested in DDMRP because it leverages their real-time platforms. That the closer we get to real-time with DDMRP, the more stable it becomes. MRP attempts to keep that full safety stock, which is basically dead inventory. DDMRP assumes that you're going to use the safety. It's what we all think the safety stock is there for. That's normal. But now DDMRP gives us the methodology in how to do it. MRP, well, where does that master production schedule come from? Well, of course, it comes from a forecast. And there's been lots of discussions on LinkedIn and the different groups about how they say DDI says you never use a forecast. We never said it. Forecasts are used for tactical and strategic planning, where they belong and where they are relevant. However, forecasts are absolutely devastating when tied directly to supply order generation. So no forecast for supply order generation, no MPS, no forward calculation of requirements and replenishments. MRP gives us priority by due date. DDMRP gives us priority by buffer status. Now, is this to say MRP is bad and evil and we're going to throw it out? No. We got a lot of criticism for calling this thing DDMRP, putting MRP in there. That's because MRP is still in there. Between those strategic decoupling points, which is our primary position for planning, is still planned dependently, as always. DDMRP now makes the assumptions under MRP valid for the first time, which is all components are available at time of order release, and I have enough time. So what can you expect from DDMRP? Now, this was done by Camelot, which is one of our largest global affiliates, and you can see what the overall improvements tend to be. You can see inventory reduction typically about a third, best in class down about 70%. Service level increase of 12%, best in class about 54%. Lead time reduction down 22%, best in class. We've seen 85 and 90% lead time reductions. When we talk about lead time reductions, we're talking about the time that it takes to respond to a customer order. Now you can see there's differences by industry, life sciences, chemicals, CPG, and industrial manufacturing. And you might say, well, that service level increase of 2% in consumer packaged goods is small, except if you're in CPG and you recognize 2 points is significant. So you can see some of the impact of DDMRP. But DDMRP is not the whole picture. It is 1/3 of that flow-based operating model called the demand-driven operating model. But that's only 1/3 of the full demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. So adaptive S&OP outputs a business plan that's translated by DDS&OP into master settings for DDOM. Okay, this sets the capability. Well, since we're doing capability and it's a range, we now can do variance analysis into DDS&OP, and DDS&OP can now do model projections. So now we can take scenarios from adaptive S&OP and evaluate them of what that choice means, what the consequence is in operations. If I'm going to deliver overnight, well, then you either need to have a whole lot of capacity or you got to have inventory. But people ask, is it outside in or inside out? Is it left to right or right to left? And the answer is yes. DDMRP takes only actual demand, outside in, all right? But it looks from inside out to say, what's the capability that I have? Where I use that is on my market-driven innovation. How is it that I create the market to which I want to drive, like Brown did with General Motors? Where is it that we want to go? We are not a victim of the happenings around us. So this is the full demand-driven adaptive enterprise model. So you might be asking, how do we get started? Well, first is understanding where we currently are. Most companies around the world today are focused on cost-based operational efficiency. And we're living in a never-ending, if you've ever seen the movie Groundhog Day, we're living the same thing over and over and over and over again. We're solving the same problems. I got too much of the wrong stuff. I got too little of the right stuff. Overall, I got too much stuff. That I've got service and I've got inventory in conflict with each other. I've got cost reduction and responsiveness in conflict with each other. So what do we do? Well, the first step is DDMRP. We start with a proof of concept pilot that says, okay, I get it. I've been to the education. I read the book, but does it really apply to my company? And I tell people, don't believe me. I always hated it when I was in class and somebody said, well, just believe me, it'll work. And I tell you, don't believe me. I wrote the book. All right, you need to prove it to yourself that it works. So try a proof of concept pilot with DDMRP and see if it works in your company, in your industry. What you're going to find out is the more variability, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity you have, the better it works. It's always the question I get asked is, which industry does it work best in? And I said, I'll tell you where it doesn't work. If you're living in a perfect world with no variability, DDMRP will not work for you. Please stay with regular MRP. And of course, everybody laughs because where is that, right? Well, once you've got your proof of concept pilot, well, then embrace the full demand-driven operating model of DDMRP with buffer management with your finite control point scheduling. Well, this gets operations under control. Well, but we can't leave it stagnant. We need to tie it to our sales and operations function. That's the book we're working on right now, is Adaptive S&OP. And Dick Ling is the lead author on this. It's Dick's crown jewels. It's this crowning book of a lifetime of being dedicated to sales and operations planning the way it's supposed to be done. Dick's work has been badly distorted globally, where people believe that S&OP is balancing supply and demand, and that's not true. So we're very excited about this new book coming out. So as a DDAE level 2, now the company is starting to leverage its operating model capability across the enterprise and actually into the market. And we've implemented these S&OP functions. And then what's the top level? Where are we going? We want to sense, adapt, and innovate across our supply chain through our customers and our suppliers, and look at how do we continually improve ROI. And this is where we now have a mature DDAE model. Now, that's not an overnight journey from stage 1 to stage 2. But what is the most difficult step? The most difficult step is getting from stage 1 to stage 2. And ThoughtWare is a must. Please invest in ThoughtWare. ThoughtWare is the software that runs between your ears. In other words, get educated. The only proof of concept pilot that I have ever seen fail was at a company. I went in the door and they said, well, it failed. And I said, okay, well, did you get people educated? Because I knew they hadn't, because I monitor all the education that goes on globally. So I knew I hadn't seen anybody from this company. And they said, no, we didn't get anybody educated. And I said, well, did you buy the book? Because that also happens. We were at one company in the Midwest of the United States. We were at a class and somebody came in from a very large company here in America. And they said, well, I'm the quality vice president for the company. We're trying to figure out how this one division was able to solve problems that we'd never been able to solve before. And he said he read this book. But this company that I was in that had the failed proof of concept, he said, no, we didn't buy the book. Well, if you didn't do the education, didn't buy the book, then what do you think you did? Well, we read some things on the internet. And everybody knows you can trust everything that's on the internet, right? Invest in your people's ability to think and to problem solve systemically. Because if you can't think systemically, then you cannot observe, identify, and resolve distortions to relative information at the systemic level. Supply chains are complex adaptive systems. If you take them apart and focus on each piece, you've now suboptimized the whole. We must look at our supply chain systemically. Well, if I can't think systemically, then I'm incapable of thinking and adapting for flow. And this isn't just flow at the operational level. This is flow also at the strategic level. This is flow at the tactical level. So I need to ensure and maintain a framework for the prerequisites for relevant information, which is we need to understand those relevant ranges. We must have a flow-based operating model. We have to have the ability to bidirectionally, tactically reconcile from the strategic to the operational range. And of course, we must have the metrics that bring alignment and coherence to all of this. So that's what I have for you today. I think we're going to open for questions. And I want to thank you very much for your attention today and for the great invitation. This is a wonderful thing that SAPIX has done. Normally, any conference held during this week, I would not travel for. It's Thanksgiving week. It's a big holiday, family holiday here in the United States. And I get to do 2 conferences this week, one in South Africa and one in China. So I get to travel virtually because it's very interesting times here in the U.S. So, Ken?
Carol, thank you very, very much for your presentation. Before I say anything else, I really want to apologize to Kia because as Jenny said to me, we've had 3 female presidents, not 2. I thought about Kia. Sorry about that. We don't have any questions or such on the discussion board here, I don't think. But what we're going to do now is go to the Demand-Driven Africa VIP lounge. So if you look on the left-hand side, you'll see VIP. If you go to the VIP lounge and you go to the Demand-Driven Africa VIP lounge, Carol's going to be there, and she can answer any questions, queries, or comments that you might have on the DDMLP methodology. Also, before you leave, please click on the poll and score the. And if you're looking for one of Carol's books, I don't know whether you can see this one that I've got here. This is the Demand-Driven Adaptive Enterprise. If you come to the Demand-Driven Africa booth, we've got a competition running. Just sign up for our newsletter, and your name will get put in the pot and we'll draw somebody out for the book for the competition. So, Carol, thank you very much. Carol, we'll see you over at. Do you know how to get to the VIP room? We'll see you over there just now.
All right. Cheers.
Okay. All right. Thank you, everybody. Hopefully see you in the VIP room. Bye.